In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the years that follow 1989, really the 2 decades that follow. And we're going to focus on this as, in many ways, a conversation about many of the economic and political and social policies that were put in place during the decade of the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, and that continue to be part of the conversation that continues in the 2 decades that follow. So that's why I've termed this lecture The Reagan Legacy, because the conversation that begins during the 1980s continues to be very influential within American politics, American society, and the American economy in the 2 decades that follow. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the presidencies of George H.W. Bush, who follows Ronald Reagan, talk about the presidency of Bill Clinton, the presidency of George W. Bush, and then briefly about the election of Barack Obama as president in 2008, and sort of the broader, sort of sum up with the broader impact of the policies of really the last 70 years or so on America's relationship with the broader global community. Reagan's legacy, certainly we have to talk about, and we mentioned this in the previous lecture, there are a number of conversations, or a number of sort of political and economic ideas that he and his supporters really promote that continue to be a part of the conversation long after Reagan leaves office. One of these is his critique of big government. This idea that government was too big, it needed to be smaller, taxes were too high, they needed to be lower, the government shouldn't be everything to everyone. And so in the 2 decades that follow Reagan's time in office, the issues of tax cuts, big government, as I already mentioned here, and kind of pro-business government policies become very, very important. It becomes something that almost pretty much every politician is engaged with, either agreeing with these or disagreeing with these. During Reagan's time in office, we began to see a transformation of the New Deal state. In other words, the welfare state, as some people kind of derisively call it. And this continues certainly under the administrations of the presidents that follow Ronald Reagan. This concern about welfare, concern about government spending on things like education and social issues, this becomes a major source of conversation within American politics and society. The last issue, which is Reagan had said was certainly one of the negatives, one of the things he was least happy about with his presidency, was the issue of the national debt. And this again becomes an issue of great conversation in the United States in the 2 decades that follow his time in office. So really these main issues that I've just marked down and highlighted here: big government, tax cuts, should government be pro-business or not? In other words, regulate business or not? What was the role of the New Deal state, of the welfare state, quote unquote, and the national debt? What was the role of the national debt within American politics and the American economy? All these are legacies that come about as sort of conversations, as things to be discussed during Reagan's administration, continue to be major points of discussion in the 2 decades that follow, and we'll touch on all these in our lecture today. Well, Reagan leaves office in 1989, and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, sort of rides Reagan's coattails into office. In some ways, you could almost argue that Bush's presidency is very much a continuation of Reagan's presidency. Bush certainly has some independent ideas, but by and large, a lot of the policies that he promoted, a lot of the things that happened during his presidency were direct outcomes of Ronald Reagan's 8 years in office. Bush is elected in 1988. He takes office in January of 1989, and his first year in office is this one of monumental change around the world. It's really truly a year of change. I mean, 1989 is up there with years like 1917 when the Russian Revolution happens, or for instance, 1789 when the French Revolution happens, or even 1776 when the American Revolutions, as a truly revolutionary year in world history. In 1989, we see a number of important things happen. Beginning in the spring, pro-democracy demonstrations begin to break out throughout Eastern Europe and these communist states that have been under very, very tight communist control since the end of World War II. In places like Eastern Europe and East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, begin to see increasing demonstrations in terms of pro-democracy taking place. In China, Chinese students and others gather in Tiananmen Square. And protest against the kind of authoritarian policies of the Chinese communist state, and that happens between April and June. In Tiananmen Square, of course, the protests are eventually crushed by the Chinese military, and many of the people are killed or are arrested and driven, or in some cases just driven off. But in Eastern Europe, the protests continue until finally in November, the states begin to respond. In November of 1989, the eastern half of Germany, East Germany, protests continue. Some of East Germany's neighbors eventually just say that they're not going to restrict passage of East Germans between the East and the West. And suddenly, in a way, sort of the walls start coming down that the Iron Curtain had put into place in the 1940s because of Stalin and other communist policies. And suddenly, Eastern Europe's looking a lot less like the Iron Curtain and suddenly looking like it's more open. Until finally on November 9th of 1989, when the East German officials announced they will no longer restrict passage between East Berlin and West Berlin, and since the Berlin Wall comes tumbling down. And this monumental change, it's hard to underemphasize how important that is, because suddenly this kind of powerful two-party system worldwide, in other words, capitalism versus communism, starts developing major cracks. And within the span of less than 2 years, this kind of powerful monumental force of communism collapses in Eastern Europe and collapses in the Soviet Union, and the Cold War that had been going on since the late 1940s suddenly ends. And the U.S. is the only power left standing, in a sense, the only superpower left standing as a result of this. So 1989 was when the first major cracks begin to appear. Quite literally, the cracks begin to appear in the Berlin Wall. Within less than a year, communist governments begin to collapse throughout Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. We begin to see the Soviet Union itself, or Soviet Russia itself, developing kind of cracks in a way. In 1991, the communist government collapses in Russia after an attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the head of the Russian state. Ultimately, a democratic election takes place. Boris Yeltsin here is elected as the new president of a now non-communist state of Russia. And all these other affiliated states in Western Asia that Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth become independent states. And ultimately, it represents this dramatic change after this 60s, almost 70 years of Cold War. And in the case of the Soviet Union, since 1917, that essentially the communists had been in control of the government. So it's just a dramatic period of a couple years when you see these massive changes taking place. It's not the only change that takes place. We also see the end, for instance, in 1990, Nelson Mandela, a freedom fighter in South Africa, is released from prison after serving many years for his revolutionary activities against the apartheid state in South Africa. 4 years later, he's elected president of South Africa and helps oversee the end of the apartheid regime, this racially segregated regime that had confined black Africans to these impoverished townships that had privileged white people living in South Africa. And again, it's a monumental shift that takes place in this nation. We also see changes taking place in Latin and South America. Many of these military governments that had taken control in the 70s and early 80s accept democracy, and they allow free elections to take place, and we have democratically elected officials taking over in nations like Chile, Brazil, Argentina, places like Nicaragua, and it's just a dramatic boost for democracy in this few short years of the early 1990s. Now, of course, change doesn't happen without conflict. And in 1990-91, the U.S., for the first time since the Vietnam War, becomes involved in a major military conflict overseas, and the so-called Gulf War of 1990-91. And really the first major post-Cold War military crisis that the United States would face. Of course, this war came about mainly out of U.S. interest in maintaining a supply of oil coming out of the Middle East when Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, invaded his neighbor of Kuwait, which had a huge amount of oil reserved, and it also put Saudi Arabia with its huge oil reserves under threat. And the United States responds by going before the United Nations and organizing a United Nations effort to defend Saudi Arabia and ultimately to order Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait. And this takes place as part of kind of two efforts organized by the United States. The initial effort to defend Saudi Arabia, known as Desert Shield, and then the war against Iraqi troops in Kuwait that then becomes known as Desert Storm. And for the United States, it's almost the perfect war in a way. It's a war that really helps dispel many of the anxieties that had followed Vietnam. This, Vietnam syndrome that I talked about in a previous lecture. This idea that the U.S. should never commit itself to military conflict overseas because it would end badly. Well, in Desert Storm, this literally 100-hour war, lasts barely 100 hours, the advanced U.S. military troops, our military equipment and military troops with very good training, and our allies in Great Britain and elsewhere in the Middle East, launched this lightning-fast strike that isolates Kuwait and ultimately utterly destroys and defeats the Iraqi occupation troops in Kuwait. And the U.S. it chooses to stop the war at that point, not continue into Iraq, as many advocated. And it really does, as the war wraps up very, very quickly in the spring of 2001, represents this huge dramatic victory and kind of morale boost for the United States. That American troops had gone in, had done their job, had cleaned house, and had very quickly ended a military threat overseas. Now, had the election taken place, the election for president taken place right after the end of the Gulf War, it's almost certain that George H.W. Bush would have won re-election. But unfortunately, after the end of the Gulf War, the U.S. enters a period of economic recession. And this kind of short, painful economic recession really hurts Bush's re-election efforts. Bush is not very successful at sort of responding to this economic crisis. And as a result, in 1992, when the presidential election does take place, his opponent, William Jefferson Clinton, better known as Bill Clinton, is very successful on capitalizing on Bush's kind of inability to deal with the economy. One of Clinton's catchphrases that becomes very popular in this election is that it's the economy, stupid. In other words, he says Bush is ignoring the economy, and that's what's hurting the United States. So in the election of 92, Bill Clinton runs against George Bush. The wild card in this race is that there's an independent businessman, Ross Perot, who's kind of a conservative businessman, runs as an independent, very wealthy, so he finances his own campaign. Well, Perot hurts Bush's re-election efforts because he really kind of splits off enough conservative voters that it helps give Clinton the edge. Clinton campaigns as sort of a very different Democrat than previous Democrats, the last Democrat in office being Jimmy Carter. Clinton campaigns as a more moderate Democrat and argues that he's economically conservative, that he in fact agrees in some cases with a lot of the Republican economic policies that had been sort of initiated under Ronald Reagan, but at the same time he was socially liberal, that he believed in a welfare state, he believed in liberal social policies and liberal government policies. Well, he does a very good job of painting George H.W. Bush as being out of touch with the average Americans. And as a result, he wins the election in 1992. and again, first Democratic president to be elected in more than a decade, in 12 years. Clinton serves 2 terms in office. His first term is far more liberal than his second term. Early on in his first term, Clinton pushes for universal health care, the idea that the government should provide universal health care from birth until death. And this becomes a huge political debate in the United States. Ultimately, Clinton's universal health care effort fails. Clinton's also involved in efforts to initiate an assault weapons ban. The Democrats in Congress pass it. Clinton signs it, and this becomes a hugely controversial measure among conservatives in the United States. On the other hand, Clinton does push some fairly kind of moderate economic policies. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, which is actually very popular among businesses, Clinton promotes as part of his sort of economic conservative strategy. But ultimately, in his first 2 years in office, as a result of the universal health care efforts, the assault weapons ban efforts, there's an increasing sense of frustration among very conservative Republicans against Clinton's presidency. And as a result, in the midterm election in '94, the Republicans, sort of led by people like Newt Gingrich with his contract with America, managed to take over the House and Senate. And it's a huge repudiation of the Democrats and of really Democrats and Bill Clinton's policies. And as a result, the Republicans, who control the House and Senate for Clinton's 6 years in office following '94, create a challenge for him. And he's forced to govern kind of a split administration, although he actually is arguably very successful at governing with a Republican House and Senate. In many cases, probably some of his most significant achievements as president in terms of legislative successes really do happen during the 6 years that the Republicans are in control of the House and the Senate. Well, Clinton is successful enough that he manages to engineer a re-election. The economy, which had struggled a little bit during his first term in office, rebounds. He kind of is successful at painting these Republicans in Congress as being really radical, and he argues that he's a much more conservative, moderating influence, and he's able to win a successful re-election despite kind of a rough first term in office. During his second term, he does indeed become more moderate, more conservative in his political ambitions. Argues for more in terms of small government, argues for fiscal responsibility, that the U.S. has to reduce its national debt and the U.S. needs to do more to run a budget surplus. In other words, to not run a deficit every year. In 1996, Clinton is very successful working with Congress to pass a very significant welfare reform act, which abolishes a number of Great Society era programs, including the aid to family with dependent children, which was a sort of a food stamps like program for young mothers with children. It also changes how welfare organizations are run, and rather than the federal government giving welfare directly to citizens, the federal government would issue block grants to states, and the states could administer those welfare block grants however they chose to. So in really what's going to devolving power from the federal government to the state level. It's also during his second term that Clinton deals with the crisis in Somalia, where the humanitarian crisis in Somalia, where U.S. troops are stationed there and then eventually pulled out following kind of the events that are depicted in the movie Black Hawk Down, where troops are killed. And also in Yugoslavia, the humanitarian crisis in Yugoslavia that the United States and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, becomes involved with, dealing with a crisis in Bosnia during this era. And so in many respects, Clinton's second term in office is quite